numbers are the way they are. Let's turn though to the real problem, because it appears that large parts of the country, whether there are tourists going to hill stations or whether indeed there are politicians, they are continuing now to violate COVID norms. It almost seems as if the second wave for them is over completely. The latest state where our politicians are failing the COVID protocols is Telangana, where Netas from both the Congress and the BJP led political rallies, social distancing norms thrown to the wind. Take a look.
Wednesday in Telangana. Friday in Telangana. Two of India's national parties doing a super swagatam for the third wave. If images like these have begun to trigger you, you're not alone. While you're constantly reminded about following rules and restrictions, these two images come like a slap in our collective faces. Brazen Netas cocking a snook at COVID norms and tearing to shreds public faith in our politicians. Let's get a closer look at the new faces of India's third wave Swagat Sena. This was Wednesday. The man leading these crowds is Revant Reddy, the Congress party's new Telangana state chief. Swarmed by supporters, Reddy's Vijay Yatra saw these disturbing images. Not only did he break all COVID norms, this ridiculous Netagiri caused huge traffic jams in Hyderabad. The Hyderabad police has booked Reddy under the Pandemic Act on the grounds that he did not seek permission. And on Friday, it was the turn of the BJP's state president, Bandi Sanjay Kumar, seen here leading a huge rally in Telangana's Nagar Kurnool district. Hundreds of BJP workers participated in the crowded rally welcoming Bandi Sanjay, who was riding a bike along with his supporters. And it looks like such crowds are the flavor of the season. The Telangana BJP chief recently announced that he will undertake a 750-kilometer long Padayatra from Hyderabad on August the 9th, right about the time the third wave is predicted to be upon us. Meanwhile, Member of Parliament from Telangana, Asaduddin Owaisi, was busy doing third wave Swagat himself. Stretching his wings in pole-bound Uttar Pradesh, he oversaw this hugely crowded inauguration of a party office in UP's Bahraich on Thursday. Do politicians have no memory of the second wave devastation? Is the KCR government in Hyderabad toothless against such netas, since the TRS itself has been an offender in terms of COVID crowds?
Telangana has lifted COVID-19 lockdown. However, the state is still reporting COVID-19 cases. Amid all these things, political parties and its leaders are busy holding meetings and rallies where many of the participants are not following COVID-19 protocol or wearing masks. When experts are warning for a possible third wave, these kind of behavior by our public representative definitely raises several questions. With camera person Damodar, Ashish in Hyderabad for India Today.
And it's not just our netas. We keep attacking netas for violating COVID protocols. We are also doing the same. Because the fact is at the moment that across this country, particularly those traveling to hill stations, are crowding them wearing no masks. So when you don't follow COVID protocols, whether you are a neta or indeed a citizen, as you are seeing in all those images, then you are asking for trouble. So clearly at the moment, we really need to get our act together. COVID is not over. The pandemic can return and there can be a third wave. So the last thing we need is maskless people with zero social distancing. Okay, let's, on that point, turn to one of our newsmakers today, because earlier I spoke to Dr Ashish Jha, Dean of Brown University's Public Health Department and one of the country's recognized global health experts. Appreciate your joining us, Professor Jha. Since we spoke last, things seem to be better. The worst is over. Is that a view you subscribe to, or do you believe that complacency is the last thing one can afford in COVID times? The kind of crowding that we are seeing at the moment, does that leave you fearful of what lies ahead? How do you see the glass, half full, half empty?
Yeah, so thank you for having me back, Rajdeep. You know, what I will say is two things. First is the worst of the second wave is certainly over. I mean, thank goodness. Those horrible days of 4 lakh cases, 4,000 plus deaths. That has clearly gotten better across the country. Still areas of hotspots, still areas that are struggling, but overall as a nation, much, much better shape. But complacency is what got India into trouble. We cannot become complacent again. We have to worry about the future. We have to think about the third wave. We have to figure out how to avoid that. And so this is not a time to relax and say, okay, finally COVID is over. COVID is not over.
COVID is not going anywhere at the moment. If COVID is not over in that sense, while the worst may be over, let's focus for a moment on the future. Is therefore the solution to vaccinate as fast as possible? Is that the only solution? As we stand, around what, 20% of Indians have had a single vaccine, but just 4 to 5% have got both vaccines. Do you believe that is now critical, that double vaccination within the next 6 months is the only way to avoid or at least defer a potential third wave?
Absolutely. There is only one way out of this pandemic. There's only one way to put this pandemic behind us, and that is to get a vast majority of the Indian population fully vaccinated with 2 doses. That's when this pandemic will end. Obviously, that's a very tall order. There's a lot of work to do to vaccinate 60, 70% of the population. We've got to go as quickly as we can, but everybody will need a second dose. Just because the Delta variant that's widely circulating in India and elsewhere really requires 2 doses.
But do you believe the other challenge is the Delta Plus variant? There's so much of talk of it now, even in India, that this could become more infectious, more contagious, and the source of a third wave. Is that being alarmist, or do you believe there is a threat of a new variant emerging in the form of Delta Plus?
Yeah, I think it's too early. We don't know enough about the Delta Plus right now. And the new mutation on the Delta Plus that makes it different from Delta is a mutation we have seen before. So I am not at this point particularly worried about Delta Plus. Or let me put it this way, I'm already very worried about Delta. Delta Plus doesn't add much concern to what is already a difficult situation. So I wouldn't focus so much on Delta Plus. Again, we may find evidence that says it is a problem, but I suspect it'll be just as bad as the regular Delta, and that is bad enough, and that's what we have to deal with.
Another issue of concern going ahead is that of so-called long COVID. You put it out on social media, I saw, of an important study that's just out of the United Kingdom that is essentially talking about how long COVID will have an impact. People who've recovered from COVID, but who are struggling with other forms of health hazards, evidence that it can lead to neurological damage also in some cases. How concerned are you about the long-term effects of long COVID, and do we need to be concerned about that in India?
I am pretty concerned, and this is one of the reasons why some policymakers who say, oh, vaccines is too hard, let's just let people get infected and then they will recover and then they will have immunity. This is a terrible policy because we don't know all of the long-term effects of COVID, but they are likely to be substantial in many people. Some people will do fine. Some people will recover quickly and have no long-term effects. But it's very clear at this point that many, many people will end up having long-term effects. And for a country our size, if we end up with tens of millions of Indians who are disabled, who have long-term neurologic issues, that's going to be a very substantial burden, not just on them and their families, but society. We must avoid that at all costs.
You know, I want to elaborate that and also put it on the top. Long COVID, that is what you're saying. Are you saying, therefore, that there are long-term effects of COVID that India needs to start studying and understanding the implications of what that will be, and we haven't understood that yet fully? Yes,
I'm saying several things. First, I'm saying that India absolutely needs to study and understand the long-term implications of COVID. That I think is very, very important. Second is I am saying that any policy that basically assumes or promotes people getting infected as a way to build up population immunity is, in my mind, a bad policy, because the long-term effects will be substantial for many people. And we have to do everything we can to avoid that. The good news is we know how to avoid that. We know how to keep infection numbers low. There are lots of public health measures. We don't have to do lockdowns. There are many other things we can do to keep infection numbers low while we get the Indian people vaccinated. And long COVID is one of the many reasons we have to be very careful about letting the infection spread too widely, too quickly.
Is it just the long-term effects, Professor, on the brains and the lungs that should worry us? Or is it much more than that? I know I'm sort of scaring our audiences, but we need to sometimes do that when they continue to flout COVID protocols.
The data suggests that the effects certainly are on the lungs, but also now we're seeing real data on effects on the brain, cognitive function. And that, of course, is very, very important for a lot of people who, but also a lot of other neurologic problems. And then there are problems with the heart, there are problems elsewhere. So we don't know all the effects of this virus. And I think we should be very, very careful about assuming that it's not a big deal if you survive, given all the data that's emerging that says for many people it can be quite debilitating over the long run.
So you are saying that the areas that could be involved here, not just smell and taste, memory formation, substantial loss of brain matter, and it could be much more widespread than initially thought of. Am I correct? Long COVID could be the big challenge.
Absolutely, absolutely. That the neurologic and brain effects of this could be quite substantial, could lead to cognitive function problems, could certainly lead to memory issues. I think smell and taste is just the tip of the iceberg of the neurologic issues that many people will end up facing.
One final question. Every day in India, we throw up figures of the number of people who've recovered, as if it seems to suggest that recovery means we've conquered COVID. You're telling us that it is much more than just recovery, that we, in a way, to stay ahead of the virus, we're going to have to do much more, monitor the people who've also recovered from COVID for the impact of long COVID. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And recovery rate has always been a funny statistic. Most countries don't use it because it doesn't really have much meaning. We expect 98, 99% of people to recover. This is a virus that doesn't kill most people, thank goodness. But just because they have recovered and have not died does not mean that there are not long-term health effects. And increasingly proportion of those people there are, and that needs to be monitored very closely.
One final question on the third wave. Are you willing to say today with any confidence to me that the third wave could get postponed or prolonged if we adopt COVID appropriate behavior, if we ensure social distancing? Or do you believe that as we open up our cities, as people sort of get overcrowding again in markets, will that lead to a potential third wave? Do you have a timeline for us for a potential third wave?
I think the timeline for a third wave is completely dependent on both policy and individual behaviors. It is completely dependent on what people do. Watching what has happened over the last few months in India and all the suffering that the Indian people have gone through, I think there is an openness and an appetite for behavior change and for doing COVID appropriate behaviors. And what am I talking about? Wearing masks, avoiding large gatherings, increasing testing. If we can do those things across India, I believe we can stave off a third wave, or if there is one, it can be small, or we can prevent one altogether and keep virus levels low without having to lock down until we get more people vaccinated. It's just that is fully really dependent on us. I don't want a third wave. Nobody does. I think we can avoid it if we do the things that we know keep virus levels low.
Dr. Jha, I wish I could be as optimistic as you on that, because all we are seeing at the moment is the large crowds gathering around hill stations of North India, people gathering in markets in Mumbai and other places. That's why I fear what the future holds, Dr. Jha.
Absolutely. Look, if you think about a country like India versus a country like Sweden, in Sweden, half the households are people living by themselves. I mean, that is not true in India, right? Where you have multi-generational households. So it's going to be different. It's going to look different. And no one says we should do what Sweden does or what America does. We have to find an Indian way of managing this. But I think anything we can do to avoid crowds. Look, the festival season is obviously both very important, but it also can be a source of a lot of danger. And so really finding ways of keeping crowds small as possible, keeping things outside much, much safer than having things inside, making sure everybody is wearing a mask. If we can do those things, I think we can find a very Indian way of out of this pandemic and out of a way to prevent that third wave.
Dr. Ashish Jha, who I spoke to earlier this week, and you can hear the full interview on the weekend. What's the Indian way to fight COVID? Remember, the pandemic is still with us. You'll get the weekend special with Dr. Jha, the entire interview. Let's take a break. When we return, I'm going to give you the Get Real India story I had promised you yesterday. Why is the pandemic driving cab drivers and auto drivers across